Hello everyone. If you watched my previous video on Serum 2 and recreating the Doom bass kind of sounds, I will have said that I'll be doing a kind of sample pack and loads more within this. And that's essentially what I intend to do in this video. I'm going to show you a demo, and then I'm going to show you how I made each of the individual samples using Serum 2, because Serum 2 is awesome, and we should be making lots and lots of presets for it, because the fact that this was a free update is freaking great. So this is going to be a more concentrated video with better emphasis and greater focus based on some feedback that I'd heard previously. And what that basically means is I'm going to be doing diagrams, and I'm going to be breaking things down in step-by-step processes, so it's both quicker to watch and easier to understand. By watching this video, you will learn how to construct an entirely synth-focused track in the style of Doom, Mick Gordon, industrial metal, and game soundtracks in general, that kind of wide band which he's really laid out for us, and also those other artists which have taken inspiration from him and things I find cool from that. So we're going to really dial in on that general synthesizer sound. A large reason for this is that I am a great activist of learning synthesizers and sound design in music, because it teaches you so much about kind of signal processing and music production in general, and can really train your ear up to be kind of awesome really in blend genres and all that stuff. I am not a fan of poorly implemented VST guitars, which gets overdone in the Argent metal scene. So I am addressing it head on by showing people alternatives and providing presets so that they can make more kind of impactful rhythm sections which don't just sound like fake guitar, because as a guitarist myself I can tell you that your riffs often sound very, very fake, and compared to modern metal artists like Humanity's Last Breath and Viotada, which are really innovating on the guitar front, you will find that it has an inferior sound and listeners are not going to gravitate towards it because you're often trying to pull off too much with an inferior set of sounds. This is in the best interest of those people, because there is a reason that I do not playlist this stuff, and that's because to me it sounds like a high quality demo and not a finished song, and I know that the listeners will react the same way. I have asked people which tracks they prefer using direct comparisons between VST guitars and real guitars, and it's nearly a 100% success rate between a technical guitar track and a badly implemented technical VST guitar track. So we're really going to dial in the synthesizers and improve your rhythm sections in that kind of riff focused way like Doom, but really trying to make it sound more like the authentic thing, because there's plenty of synthesizer work which needs to be focused on. So that's the crux, and I want to emphasize this isn't going to be an effort to make an exact copy in the end product. It is going to be an effort to understand the general persuasion implied by the artist through the three methods, which are pathos, logos, and ethos. If we look at the pathos, we're going to be looking at the timbres, we're going to be looking at the synthesizers and the elements within. Are they using rising tension? Does it create unrest in the listener during the ambient sections to then build up to the awesome overcoming in that push forward combat? We're going to look at the logos. What are the technicalities behind the synthesizers? We're going to look at what exactly makes them work well in terms of phasing, in terms of stereo width, and in terms of impact. You know, that kind of really technical element. We're going to boil it down and make it nice and concise. And finally, last but not least, this is probably the most difficult one to integrate. We're going to look at the ethos. Ethos essentially means adherence to the systems around it, adherence to the community. You know, Mick Gordon, he has laid out so many interviews, podcasts, and details on how he creates his music, and really, when people ask me how do I make Doom music, I can't give them it in a simple answer, because it's already been so well defined by the man himself who innovated on it that it's really a goldmine. He doesn't want to just have it defined to one single genre, he wants to impact the entire music scene as a whole. So really, Argent metal and industrial metal and doom style music is all about innovation and pushing forward metal music and validating metal music within a wider music scene within video games, and, you know, making it more acceptable to people by the use of technology and squishing down on ignorance and unwillingness to change.
Why? No developer wants to be associated with such a joke, right? That harsh, aggressive, upfront sound that you get from a guitar is exactly appropriate, and it was the thing that was missing from the soundtrack.
I'm probably losing you with all this kind of ranty theoretical stuff, so in order to up my viewer retention, I'm just going to show you the finished product straight away, and then we're going to do all the technical stuff. to add to that and create a kind of sense of motion, we're going to add our diminished doom array. This is the echo and distortion channels. If you know about the doom array, if you don't know about the doom array, then just pay attention. Essentially, that's going to start with a sine wave, and with that, we're going to grab some noise. And something quite important that you do for the proper sound is to run the noise through a filter, and you want to make sure that's set to ring modulator, so ring mod. And basically then that's going to use this button here, which is kind of like a little piano or something that basically locks the frequency of the filter to the note, which is something which is very useful and very cool within Serum 2. You essentially want to do that. You can mess around with envelope, and that's all you really want to do. Maybe you want to attach the level of the noise to the mod wheel. That's also a very, very good trick. But the most important thing is to make sure that you get the routing correct. So basically what you're going to do is you're going to make sure that the oscillator A is not routing to main, but it's routing to bus 1 and it's routing to bus 2. So from there, you're going to take your noise, you're going to make sure that that routes to the filter, which you're using for the ring modulation, and you're going to route that also to bus 1 and bus 2. And essentially, to summarize it very quickly, because I've already done a video on this, you're going to stack distortions, you're then going to add more ring modulation, another filter. You can again change the order of these how you see fit, and you're just going to basically stack distortions on one channel, and on the other channel you're going to do a bit of distortion for a kind of compression sound, add some tape kind of echo or delay, any delay you really like, and a nice bit of reverb on the end. That will then sum to a bus with a very healthy amount of compression. So that's going to sound something like this. Okay, so what we've created there are 2 of the 4 channels of the original hardware array. So what we can also do is swap those channels out and make different presets, because we are constrained to 2 buses in Serum. It would be very nice to have more. That would be my main feedback to them. Introduce up to maybe 4 or 5, maybe infinite buses to Serum. And what we can do to work around that is basically choose the different channels for the right song section and then create the appropriate sounding sound effects from that, because that's what you do anyway. You're going to edit the volume of the different buses via either sidechain gating or like MIDI triggers or whatever you want to do to create that expression. I've done videos previously on how to do that. So using that principle, we're going to start with the same basic oscillators, and we're going to then change our FX processing so that it's different. The distortion channel, because this is still including the distortion channel, will be the same. So that's bus 1. Bus 1 will be the same, but bus 2 will change. Basically, the way it's going to change is very simple. We're just going to be adding a load of distortion, normally wave shapers and bit crushers, to emulate this pedal called the Geiger counter. That's the one. I was going to say tactical newt because that's the VST emulation, but it's actually called the Geiger counter. And we're going to be using either a phaser, so the phaser effects, which sounds nice, or we're going to be using a filter. And what we can do is we can make the phasing filter react to envelopes, basically. So then that plays with notes, and that's a very, very nice sound. It emulates this kind of pedals and CV effect you get with the Mutron biphase, where it kind of moves with the note, and it creates this really cool, nice sound. Obviously, if it was analog, it would probably sound even richer and stuff, but this is what we've got in Serum. Serum does not sound bad by any means, by the way. And we get this really cool kind of sound. So let's listen to it. Now, you'll notice what I'm doing there is I'm creating a kind of glitch effect. The way I do that is I actually change the wavetable of the sine wave. So I said that you generate this with a sine wave, right? But I was just messing around with some of the oscillators and some of the spectral stuff you can do in Serum, which is the advantage of Serum. And you can just kind of maybe square it out and really increase that pulse width or something. So then you get this really cool kind of sound, and you change the morph to something like crossfade. And basically after you do that, you can then control the wavetable position. And that produces really cool glitch sound. It sounds like it's down sampling a load, and increasing the pulse width a load. So you can get these really cool, like, not really dubsteppy, but more kind of sound effecty parts. I believe I do some more back here. But what that does is it skyrockets the amount of overtones in that sound, and then that produces more high-end frequency, and what the listener's going to do is associate that with, you know, going up in pitch. It's not really going up in pitch, it's just creating more overtones. So it's one of those kind of outside the musical realm, more into the psychoacoustic realm type of sound. Next we're going to tackle is our Cultist Bass synth. Now I've made a short on this, which is quite fun to go and watch if you want to understand it in a kind of more effects focused way. But basically we can actually create this entirely within Serum, and the main thing about this sound is the icon has kick digital wavetable. It's basically a kick made into a wavetable, and it produces really cool sounds. What we're going to do is we're going to take our envelope 2 and we're going to do a very, very kind of short profile like this, and that's then going to go to the wavetable position of the kick. And from here you can do various different things to modulate it. So you can either do an LFO, which is a free LFO, so that's basically going to be like an envelope shaper, or you can do something where you basically just do it per note. So you can turn that LFO off and you can focus more on what it does per note. So you can maybe accentuate the kick icon has kick modulation a bit more, or maybe you want to accentuate the filter a bit more. That's the main key. That's why there's a V1 and a V2. One is using the envelope shaper, and the other one is going to use the envelope of the actual note trigger. If we go into the effects, we can see that again we're stacking distortion. Something that's quite important with this one is to make sure that you have an asymmetrical wave shaper to get the proper sound, because you're going to basically be varying in amplitude of the actual gain of the wavetable, so you want to make sure that that's there. And generally speaking, it's nice to have a filter behind that distortion or a ring modulator, and again more just kind of sine wave saturation. Something which is very nice to add is a bit of hyper dimension. This will add a bit more kind of stereo width and kind of a unison effect, which doesn't directly affect the oscillator itself, so it's kind of like a post unison effect. And something else which is very important with this sound, if you're going to not apply any filters, so something we'd likely see on the V2 where there's no filter controlled by the envelope shaper, is basically a multi-band compressor, which if you look at here, the lines are diagonal only on the highs, and what that's doing is it's compressing the high end only. So we're going to knock off a lot with that, and then afterwards we're going to add our healthy amount of compression, because compression makes stuff sound very full. This is something very fundamental to the sound of the song, and it's going to sound something like this. A lot of expression there. So from from there, it's more important that we create a impactful synthesizer, which doesn't just sound like a kind of acid synth, to get that more doom style metal / synthesizer electronic music sound. And basically to achieve that, we're going to get some very mechanical sounding sounds, basically. And the way we achieve that is essentially by importing a sample of something like a lawnmower. That's actually what is used on Cultist Bass. He also tends to use chainsaw samples, blender samples, and an actual trick he tends to use, I don't have it to hand right now, but you can get a little piezo microphone, and that will reduce a lot of the acoustic noise from something like a lawnmower or a blender or a chainsaw, and only capture the sound of the engine. So if you want to create some really cool kind of samples, I recommend getting a electronic magnification microphone, a EMF microphone if you look it up, or a piezo microphone is what they're called. That will help you create really cool samples. What we're then going to do is we're going to pick a point where that sample is more like an oscillator, something where the pitch is constant. You can not do that. It has a cool effect, and generally speaking, you're going to want to reinforce this, because unless you've got a really high quality sample, in this case I didn't go and get one, even though I probably could have gone and got one, you can just reinforce it with some basic oscillators, and this creates a cool effect where you can blend between the two by increasing the level of one and maybe decreasing the level of the other. You can integrate that into your macros if you want to, but something which is very important for a synthesizer like this is to have a very strong sub frequency, and in this case we're going to use a square wave as the sub frequency, a mono sub, which is in the same octave because we're going to be using octave 0. Essentially very, very low frequencies, sub frequencies, but we're going to have a lot of distortion coming off of that. Now, you can integrate envelopes into the effects processing. That's quite useful to do. If we look at our main bus, so we're operating on a one bus principle here, we're again stacking distortion, pretty standard. But something which we're actually going to do is we're going to apply a little EQ shelf based on the envelope of 2. So we're basically going to do an inverse kind of macro thing, inverse matrix gain, whatever you want to call it, and basically that's going to bump up the gain of this shelf. And if I play it real quick, you'll see what I mean. You'll see how that basically bumps up the gain of that shelf in a very nice animated kind of way. And essentially that's then going to go into another asymmetrical wave shaper, because these are really good for getting distorted sounds, and that's our core principle of the sound. That's essentially our mono / core sound. Everything after we do that is going to be augmented. So we are using unison on the wavetables, and we're using quite a large amount of unison to create more stereo, because I don't want to double track this in a Serum only track, because that's impractical. Instead, we're going to rely on the stereo unison effects on the oscillators, but we're also going to make sure that our sub is cranked up quite high so it doesn't completely dominate the stereo field. What we can do in Serum 2, which is something which is very useful in the effects processing, is use a splitter between the lows and the highs. And essentially what we're going to do to the lows is we're going to apply this thing called utility. That's going to create a mono section in the bass, and that's essentially just going to help tighten up that low end, so when it comes to actually mixing the thing, we're not going to be having, loads of clashing stereo frequencies in the bass range. That can be a cool effect sometimes, but it has to be very niche. It's more of a kind of, you do it for cinematic purpose. It's not good for songs in general. Characteristic of the low end if you want it to be consistent in a song which is quite action packed. And what we're going to do is we're also going to apply hyperdimension. This is going to create stereo width in the highs, and we're going to have this on variable size dependent on macros, and essentially that's going to kind of widen up the top end a nice amount. You can use something like Bode. If I grab that, you can use something like Bode. I don't recommend it because it introduces a lot of detuning, which you don't really want happening later on in the sound. And after all that kind of fuss, you're going to do a single band compressor. You could maybe try a multi-band compressor, but generally speaking, single band compressors work really well for these thick rhythm sections, and then everything you do afterwards in the mix can be to adjust to kind of balance it out and make it sit a bit better. That's going to sound something like this. And if you want to get really fun with it, you can do something like this. Now, the Iconized Kick wavetable is very versatile. If you apply some unison to it early on, and you make an actual kind of sub bass out of it. So the key here is going to be making sure that the wavetable position is a bit lower, because as you kind of vary between the wavetables, the higher up you go on the specific wavetable, the more high end it adds, more overtones it adds. So we're going to basically rely on the kind of lower end of that, but we're still going to take advantage of its very fun modulation patterns. And this is a really nice one to do automation on. It creates a really cool drop sound. And it's actually kind of got this characteristic where it's very vocal, and this is why I say it's a bit more like Doom Hunter than it is Cultist Bass, because when you add this in, it's kind of dubsteppy. It's really dubsteppy actually, and basically we're going to just be layering that with, again, saw waves in unison, bit of unison on this thing. We're going to look at the mix. We see that basically we have, again, one single bus. Right at the start, we're going to be applying that mono bass because we really want to tighten up that kind of unison thing. We don't want that stereo conflict. And asymmetrical wave shapers, general saturation, ring mod, a nice filter, which is attached to what seems like a macro, I believe. That's very useful. And the sine shaper, which is very dramatic distortion. So this thing, we expect it to have a very kind of aggressive sound due to all the distortion going on. And one thing which we actually want to bring out more, because there's so much going on in the low end, there's going to be a lot of muddy low end build-up due to all this distortion, is to actually clamp down on the mids and to clamp down on the lows. So it's kind of the opposite of the Cultist Bass V1, where instead we're going to use the multi-band to like open up the highs for that increased clarity, and then we're going to clamp down on the lows so it's more controlled. This one is very difficult to control because it has so much low end build up, especially with that unison. So you're going to really want to clamp that in, and you're going to get a very cool sound. So that sounds something like this. If you notice, that kind of little fill sound is actually the same synthesizer there. We're actually using a special little automation which increases the detune just on those notes. So that's something to really think about with your macro strategy. When you strategize the macros well, you can get much more out of a synthesizer sound instead of having to switch synths or import sound effects. Let's start with our Shepards tone risers. So the first thing we're going to do is grab a spectral kind of wavetable and make sure it's on spectral mode, so you actually get the kind of modulation, which is the Shepards tone modulation. That's basically going to do a looping riser. And from there, we're going to make sure the scan rate is just normal. And we're going to add a bit of an oscillator, something like a triangle. Maybe you want to add a square or something like that. And we're going to add a bit of noise. What's going to then happen is we're going to add an LFO, which loops and rises. This is essentially going to attach to the modulation of the Shepards tone. which you can find under Spectral. So Shepards W or Shepherd, that will be the Shepherd's tone modulation, and then you can basically loop that from there. We're going to just use a main bus, one bus. We're going to add some distortion, some convolution reverb, and we're going to compress it afterwards. You can then add macros to any modulations you see fit. And that's going to sound something like this. So we've looked at our previous Shepherd's tone, but it's more of a general ambience. It covers a very wide range of the frequency spectrum. Sometimes when you have something playing along with a heavy kind of rhythm dominant section, so domination of rhythm over harmony, which is a concept which I talked about a lot in the kind of info panels on the song, that's when you want something a bit more piercing. So I call this a Shepherd's tone piercing. You're going to use a more dramatic wavetable, let's say, something like this one I've got here, and you're going to use the spectral tab for the Shepherd's tone modulation again, but this time you might want to add some extra modulation like shift, where it kind of shifts the entire frequency up. This is very useful in macros, so you can kind of choose how much highs you want per the section. So in fact, like, you could maybe do a load of Shepherd's tone rising over a certain section, then shift it up and continue it even more for that constant rising tension throughout the song, which is a constant theme in Doom and a very, very good cinematic principle. In songs like Dunkirk, it's used almost exclusively as the soundtrack if you want to see an experiment in Shepherd's tones. So we're really using that looping riser concept for constant tension, which has so much thematic influence, to actually deliver that on all sections of the song, and that's going to create a kind of existential dread. So when we look at this, we're going to be using more aggressive distortion because I love distortion, and again, asymmetrical wave shaping will get you that sound. You know, we're compressing it a lot with the multiband. Here I wanted to knock out a lot of the mids so it wouldn't basically take up any of those. I don't knock out the lows mainly because there are no lows, but I mean, you could knock out the lows as well. This is affecting the actual gain of that band. And we're going to use like vintage reverb, and again, scooping out even more mids so it just sits in the mix with the other heavy stuff really well, and mono bass from there, because, you know, we want this thing to be very tight and piercing and only occupy the high end frequencies. And that's going to sound something like this. You can really hear the squeeze at the end of that. That's really kind of what you want. But you'll also kind of notice there's a lot more space going on in other sections. So something like this. It's just a way to introduce the thing in a more subtle way, because you don't always want it like full blast. Sometimes you want it to be more kind of suppressed to begin with, so then you can continue its length even further. So then you can have, again, the constant rising tension principle. You continue its length even further so it's borderline inaudible, but still providing harmonic content to the overall mix. And psychoacoustically, the listener won't recognize it until it's loud and piercing, but psychoacoustically it's still there, and they're still able to notice even subconsciously. That's what you want to do. So it wouldn't be a Doom-style track, obviously, without a catchy melody of sorts. So here is the first melody that we introduced. We're going to have lots of different timbres of leads. So we're going to start with something like FM piano, and we're going to use basically a modulation to create a really nice morphing kind of layout for it. So it's not going to be something which is constant, it's going to be something which is forced to change constantly. So that's the idea of constant movement, that's the idea of constant evolution, and developing the kind of tension and combat constantly. Like, doom music is all about movement, therefore you need movement in your synthesizers. You cannot have them being static unless they are trying to make a short impulse, a short statement, where the rhythm will dominate. So again, we're going to take very large use of effects. So something we again want is a nice aggressive wave shaper reverb. Flanger is really nice. Like, for these style of leads, flanger on Serum is really good, and it creates this warbly effect where it's very kind of unstable sounding, and that's often what you want. If you've got so much stability in the lows and in the drums, you want something to mesh it together and create an overlayer of melodic or like timbre based chaos. So then it feels like the order going on beneath it is essentially trying to essentially clamp down on what's going on above it. It's almost as if they're kind of interweaving, fighting, but also serving a greater purpose at the same time, almost like kind of serving a kind of story based prophecy or something. That's basically what you want to try and aim for, the kind of combat between the two elements here. And the goal of the melody is not to completely dominate and create a really catchy tune like it would in a pop song, but rather to mesh together the rhythmic ostinatos, chaos, and aggression from those elements. That's essentially what you want to aim for here. And below all that, again, just compress the living heck out of it. We don't care about preserving the dynamic qualities because people aren't going to have this cranked up on their stereo systems. I mean, they might, but generally speaking, they're not going to be wanting a true classical music experience where they want like very, very low pits of low and like extreme emotional range. They want the opposite. They want it to cut through the chaos and the indecision in their life. That's essentially what doom music is. So that's why you're going to make very piercing melody leads to deliberately kind of conflict with the rhythms going on beneath them. But again, only those two elements. It's very easy to set one against the other. If you don't want loads and loads of elements conflicting, you only want the struggle between A and B, is good versus evil. You can introduce some risers and some general ambience for kind of tone setting and space setting, but generally speaking, you do not want more than two elements competing with each other, kind of melodically, rhythmically, harmonically. Everything else aside from those two elements, and obviously the drums are their own element because drums we're going to separate from this, they're the only things competing in terms of music space, stuff that's playing notes. So our first lead is going to sound like this. Our next lead instrument, we want to drastically vary the timbre, and the way we're going to do this is by choosing a different wavetable and applying envelope-based modulation, kind of like scan effects, where basically we're modulating using warp on one wavetable, and that wavetable is going to be on 0 volume, so then we can affect the other wavetable through something like FM, RM, PD, AM, like that kind of stuff. We're going to basically sweep it and make sure that the bass oscillator is the thing getting attacked, and that's going to create a very, very interesting type of sound, a very, very unique timbre. That's going to sound something like this. Again, constant motion, constant tension, the battle between the rhythm and the melody. Alternatively, sometimes you need to create a lead sound which is the embodiment of just pure timbre for the sake of rising tension, and one way you can achieve that is by essentially using a very kind of drastic detuning. So this is where the bowed effect comes in very useful. It creates this really cool frequency shift sound. And basically all we're doing here is we've got a LFO, LFO1 set to a kind of strange pattern of sorts, and we're going to use that to directly affect something like the filter here, and you're going to see that that filter kind of moves around a lot, and depending on the macros it's going to have a different level of resonance. And this is really atonal leads, so these are tension leads, so the idea of melody is completely abandoned. We only want timbre, and that's the idea of why it's an insistent lead. It insists that its presence is there, but it's not there to make a statement. It's just there to create a presence, almost as if like it's a last-ditch effort by the opposition to the rhythm to try and control it. And that's why it comes in the most impactful rhythm section area, because it's essentially like the melody has now given up hope, essentially, and it's trying a last-ditch effort to overcome it. Therefore, that's why it's happening at the climax, because it's like that hopeless scenario. So we're going to give that a listen. Next, I'm going to give you a very simple trick, which is some kind of secret sauce. So if you actually look at the mix of those basses I was doing, and you think about what's going on in that low end, we really don't want phase conflicts going on in the low end. We can tolerate it in the mids. We can't really tolerate it in the highs because of a compression principle. In lossless quality files, it's completely fine. But if you have lossy quality files like MP3s, you can't have stereo width in your highs, because basically it's going to reduce the amount of information there and increase the amount of non-coherent phasing going on there. So considering that, and the fact that we want a nice stable, solid low end, because this is what the human ear likes, we're actually going to take all of our kind of aggressive basses and we're going to roll them off around the fundamental frequency of the song. So if your bass root note is E, because you're using something like Phrygian, like E Phrygian, which is the same as C major, which is a really common scale because it's just all the white notes on your keyboard. Basically, you're going to roll it off on something like E1, which is just above the sub frequency. So then you're not getting those super low end sub frequencies conflicting with each other. So from there, we can apply this principle. A sub bass, which is ideal and only occupies one frequency with no overtones, is going to look like a sine wave. However, that's not necessarily what we want. Sometimes you essentially want to add more. You're going to want to add more. So basically what we can do is we can have a wavetable like this, and if we look at the morph, we can select something like the crossfade morph, and we can actually blend between something with more overtones like this. Each one of these little bars in Serum is an overtone. So we can blend between something which is the singular tone, the root tone, or like the root note, and we can blend its overtones in, which is essentially due to saturation. And we can create a nice sub bass which varies based on the wavetable position. Now I don't know, oh yeah, it's because I've set that there. Yeah. It's not animating. I think in Serum 1 it likes to animate a bit more. But right now, like, that is essentially changing the wavetable position. Yeah. That's good fun. That can introduce overtones on the fly. It's very useful, and sometimes you want a bit of envelope with that to make it sound more natural. Now, I'm not going to show off the sound of that because it's just going to be a sine wave, but something I am going to show off is something you can do with it. So from that principle, it's then very easy to create something like a sub drop. So that kind of sound you hear in so many songs, where it's kind of like a sub drop, it's very easy to create something like that. And all we really have to do is take our same principle. Maybe you want to add overtones, maybe you don't want to add overtones to it, but we're actually going to add an envelope which is going to attach to the coarse, and make sure it's the coarse pitch, not the normal pitch. You can do it with normal pitch, like octave pitch or semitone pitch, but make sure it's to the coarse pitch, because you're going to get much more range out of the coarse pitch. You're going to basically attach that to the envelope, and it's going to do a kind of big old ping. Let me try and find an example. It's going to do a big old ping, which is basically then going to go down the envelope and drop off into your root frequency if it hits the floor here. Now, something really nice you can do is layer that with a kick attack, so it sounds more like a drum. And from there, very simple processing. Actually, I say that, not really. It's very simple processing, but you often want to use a clean signal. So if you're routing it to bus 1 and bus 2 in the mix, you can see that we're routing it to both. You want a clean signal, which represents kind of the bass sound. If you were in an anechoic chamber, for instance, you'd only hear the clean signal, you wouldn't hear any reverberation. But then we're going to get something to emulate the room around it. So we're going to add saturation, a bit of delay, and a bit of reverb. That emulates the kind of room sound effect, so you can get a wider, more cinematic impact. And after that, again, more saturation for bringing it out, and just single band compression will go very, very far. So let's now talk about the more sound design focused elements. So this is more just general SFX stuff you could kind of slam in a video game and it could be quite cool. It's going to be something like a short riser. I'm just going to play it straight away. That's very simple. It's a sound on spectral. We set the scan to -100% because basically that's now reversing the sound. And all we're going to do is just get an LFO to essentially lift the filter. You could hold this down and essentially like have it loop with the filter, but basically it's going to be very simple. We're just going to throw effects on it which we like: bode, compressor, convolve, to create more space, very similar to the previous sounds we're creating, giving them timbre, character and expression. And that's the main principle. The main thing you want to concentrate on is how long your LFO is. So you might want to have something which is only lasting a bar for a riser, or maybe like a quarter bar, and that will just essentially create a static riser. It's not something that loops, it's not a long enduring tension, it's something for a kind of break in a song or a transition piece. And last but not least, I'm going to show you a very cool way to make these really fun computer sounds. Essentially just chuck some wavetables together and put like an arpeggiator on, and maybe some extra like filter and effects, some corruption you could do, like downsampling is really fun, for instance, wave shaping is really fun. I'm going to use that same scanning principle where we apply FM on a LFO modulated oscillator to basically scan our bass wavetable, and you're going to end up with sounds which, you know, sound very fun, very ear candy like this. So yeah, that was a lot of fun. I hope you enjoyed me talking about a lot of the rational principles behind doom music in a very kind of technical but easy to understand way, by using a lot of diagrams and explaining through each individual synthesizer sound. Essentially, if you want details on how I made the other elements of the song, such as the drum sample I'd like to use, how I end up mixing it, and possibly seeing how it's going to fit into a wider release of music where it's all this kind of style of stuff, a lot of experimentation going on, then please head over to my Patreon and I will be doing deep dives on this style of content. My next video in this kind of series, there might be a video or two after on some smaller topics if they pop up, but basically my next video is going to be on the metaphysics of doom music, and if you don't know what that means, it's basically the immaterial principles. You know, we're going to look at what actually makes it resonate with people and how we can incorporate that into core songwriting principles, how we can build artists' kind of sounds from it, which don't completely just copy and paste exactly what's going on in the soundtrack in terms of aesthetics, you know, so you can actually kind of learn something from it and create music which is genuinely interesting, both thematically in terms of sound design and in terms of adhering to the wider community around it. We're going to really look at that, but mainly focus on the emotional elements and why people resonate with it. So yeah, I've been Juff, and thank you for watching. These presets will be available in my Discord, so join that if you want to continue the discussion, but I'll leave it till next time. Thank you very much for watching.